So would you rather a situation essentially that the big get bigger and everyone else is allowed to just fall by the wayside? You wouldn't have intervened, point one. And secondly, when it comes to those outside influences that have had such a key role since the GFC, you'd say no outside appointments. They've all got to be civil servant mandarins.
No, there's a couple of issues there. In terms of too big to fail, I think that the Americans did the right thing about bailing out their banks and their other financial institutions, because as President Bush said, if they hadn't, there would have been a Great Depression. But the inconsistent part of it was letting Lehman Brothers fail. And the global financial system went into gridlock for about 6 months, and that was a very dangerous time. Now, fortunately, we survived that. But
yes, and it's then the next chapter as to how we approach future crises.
Yes.
And issues like regulation. You're quite critical of what hasn't been done since that Lehman collapse.
That's right.
Why are we dragging our heels over this?
Well, look, it's a very difficult problem, but there are two opposite ways to handle it. We can continue with a very lax regulatory framework, which is what we've had, or we can tighten it so far that we strangle the golden goose that is capitalism. Now, in the book, I've tried to come up with a set of recommendations that drive through the middle of that and would keep the system going without the risks that we've been taking.
Isn't the danger, though, then that things are cast as too, I guess, lukewarm, and it's a bit like financial regulation in this country, even this week, the criticisms being you've tried to win over the sector itself at the expense of, if anything, being more hard-headed. An opportunity missed, in other words.
Well, Australia's in the better shape, much better shape than the American system, although even in Australia, as you know, we required the government to bail out the banks to the extent of guaranteeing their deposits and their overseas borrowings, which is partly a symptom of our current account deficits. But, you know, the trick is to promote capitalism and all the benefits, including booms, by the way, because a lot of good things happen in the booms. But limit the madness of the boom so that we don't get a big bust.
I just want to clarify, though, back on, because it's again the idea of promoting capitalism, promoting leaders in their field. You referred earlier to Goldman Sachs, Hank Paulson, Treasury Secretary, so parachuted in from the glass tower experience. What is so antithetical to your idea there that shouldn't be allowed to happen?
Well, he can't help having views that are deeply imbued with the private sector ethos in America, which is, quite frankly, a get-rich-quick mentality. Now, I'm not against big salaries. I've had the benefit of them myself. But obscenely big salaries, much beyond what's required to make people come to work, is part of the downfall.
But he
didn't
take that job inside Treasury for the cash, because as you say, he made his millions.
He was already wealthy.
Yeah.
Look, it's a great theory that someone can become a pure regulator, but by and large, I'm mostly in favour of career people doing these things. You know, perhaps the Reserve Bank's got a bit more market focus now, but in my day it was a place where people worked not for money at all, because the salaries were very low, and the pension, I can tell you, is even lower.
So why do they do it? Because they had a calling, they had that sense
they think they have a calling.
Right.
And they don't need to be paid $1 million to come to work.
But do you worry that the world has changed on that score from the very earliest days now of our education system even?
Absolutely.
You know, you're not actually a winner unless you have an iPad.
That's true. But there's another point, if I could make it, a separate point. It's that, you know, people aren't taught the basics. And always the cry is bail somebody out. Now, as I've said, we had to bail the big banks out, but I would have put conditions on it that would have meant they wouldn't want it to happen again. But we've got to teach the kids, if something looks too good to be true, it probably is too good to be true.
But isn't that greed, though, in its starkest form, the fact that we can even be told that? And it's like a child being told, don't go to that cookie jar, Sammy. Don't go there, because we're having dinner in 5 minutes.
Absolutely.
The more you say don't, the more people want to do it.
Well, that's true, but we've got to a culture of greed, and where people don't really care about the bigger picture. They just want to make their own multi-millions.
Let's understand, in the time remaining, our domestic inflationary problem, as you flagged it earlier on. What gives you cause for concern there? Because it seems the Reserve Bank's not going to do anything next week, despite a hot consumer price print this week, despite signs that mining boom shows no signs of abating, which is coming at a big detriment to other pockets of the economy. Where's the real inflation problem for you showing up?
It's showing up in wage claims. It's showing up in cost of living. And here's a connectivity that's really important. They say underlying inflation still under the 3% target point at the top of the range. But people who work for a living, they don't care about underlying inflation. They care about the actual cost of living. And all the utilities are going up.
Well, isn't that the point?
Food.
Well, no one's denying that.
Petrol.
Absolutely. You only need to look out on the forecourt on any main street to see that one for what it's worth. But what makes you so convinced that events were that seismic for this generation 18 months ago, the height of the GFC? They were. And so
we were saved by the GFC in that sense.
And in that sense, would you agree, in turn, people's attentions turned to paying down debt? So those wage demands you flag aren't necessarily, by extension, inflationary.
Yeah, look, it's a very good point. But typically central banks, and even the Australian Central Bank, which is well ahead of average in its performance, they still tend to be too little too late in tightening policy, because no one likes to be the bloke that brings the bad news. But that we need a central bank to stand against all the other pressures for letting it rip.
You'd agree, though, that it's all economy specific. Reserve Bank of New Zealand likes to look for signs specifically before it will tighten, whereas ours likes to slightly be ahead of the curve. Is that a fair distinction?
In the old gold standard of the 19th century, they used to do everything on the basis of gold in the vaults, which is a lagging indicator. The great thing about doing it on the basis of inflation, that's a leading indicator, and if you do it on the basis of expected inflation, then that's a proper leading indicator. So in principle, we got a better system. But I got to say, with the Americans misusing the system, maybe we need to go back to a modern form of the gold standard. That's one of my conclusions.
There it is. China, you say, perhaps is more cognizant of that than others. Brief final thought. Where are you picking the next bubble? Is it in that commodity space that you're
in the middle of a commodity bubble of heroic proportions, and if we play it right in Australia, it'll make us a vastly richer nation. Already has. But of course, booms always lead to busts, and we've got a plan. As I see the newspapers today are saying, we need a sovereign wealth fund. That's part of what we need. We need budget surpluses. The underlying budget is deeply in deficit now, should be already in surplus.
It's very interesting. I mean, that's such a other big topic of conversation, because, take it all back to the US. Percentage of GDP, ours is what? 9%? Theirs is how much?
Yes. But if you want to,
this is in the double digits, Peter.
Yes, but if you want to be one of the great nations, which is what we should want to be, you've got to be a lot tougher than the United States on these things.
So you don't think Chris Caden's right from BT Financial when he says we're a nation of debt fetishists?
Yeah. Well, it's not a bad description, but Chris is a good wordsmith.
As are you, and we wish you well with your latest offering, Great Crises of Capitalism. It's an heroic endeavour, really, I've got to say, and I'm sure viewers are going to find this compelling. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Carson.
Coming and shedding some light. Appreciate it. P.D. Jonson, a.k.a., of course, Henry Thornton, column appearing first Tuesday of the month in The Australian. Watch it, read it, distill it, because it is really on the money.